What's up, everybody? It's Shaban. Welcome back for another game programming concept lecture. Today we are going to be talking about serialization. I want to talk about this because I feel like there's a lot of confusion around this idea, and sometimes it's kind of overcomplicated or confused with other concepts. So let's start with kind of the first confusion. There's some confusion that serialization should be spelled with a second S. I'm not sure where that comes from. Okay, I'm kidding. Sorry for all of you in the United Kingdom or wherever else it's spelled with an S. In fact, you can leave a comment below. Tell me how it's spelled where you're from. Anyways, let's start with what serialization is not. It is not. What the heck isn't it? Anyway, so some consider it to be kind of like the opposite of binary or something like that. Okay, so this is not correct. We're not going to be talking exactly what binary means or binary formats mean, but it is certainly not the opposite of binary. In fact, some serialization formats are themselves binary, so it's definitely not mutually exclusive. We're not going to worry too much about that today. It's not that. I suppose there's also some confusion that it's like the opposite of parallelization or something like that. Parallelization. That makes sense, right? Serial, parallel, or something like that. No. So when we're talking about serialization, as we would with game development, typically is nothing to do with parallelization. Now that is an idea and has to do with like threading, but this has really nothing to do with that. So don't worry about that. So it's not like the serial parallel kind of thing. It's not really related for the primary topic of today, and it's not related to Cheerios. Or at least not really. Anyway, so what should I do? Should I like cross a line out? Can I do that? Like just draw a line kind of like through each of these? Yeah, those were some pretty terrible strike throughs. Anyway, so what the heck is it? All right, so to kind of talk about it, let's talk about playgrounds. Now bear with me, okay? So this might not seem like it makes sense first, but don't worry about it. Okay, so playground. So I'm going to attempt to draw a playground, right? So we got a slide. Ooh, beautiful. Right, and it's kind of got the little things on the top. And there's always like this like weird hut in the middle, as if like the children are going to be like staying the night in the playground, got to be sheltered from the rain or something. I'm not sure what that's about. Then there might be like a little climbing wall, you know, one of these little things over here, and other types of stuff, so that children can feel like they're incredibly, you know, skilled at climbing things. They're pretty good, actually. What else is there? There's kind of like one of those like curly slides, I guess. It's like curls around or something. That's supposed to be a curly slide. Anyway, so you got this little jungle gym, right? And then you might have some other kinds of playground equipment. Who knows? But the point here is that let's say that this playground is in a particular park, but for some reason they decide they need to move the playground or something like that. How the heck are they going to move the playground from this park to another park? Maybe this is like the park for the rich people or something like that, you know, some kind of gentrification of the city or something like that, and they're like, okay, we got to take this park and put it into the poor part of the city or something like that. Had to bring up politics, then I. Anyway, so how would they do that, right? So you got to break it down into little pieces so that you cut it up, like cut it into tiny little pieces, and then you have to deliver it over to another park and then reassemble it in the other park. But here's the problem. How do you break it? Whoopsie diddle. How do you break it down into little pieces, and how do you have the instructions on how to rebuild the playground in the other parks? It's kind of like we've got like the dotted line version of this kind of thing. There has to be some kind of instructions and some kind of order to the madness. This is basically what serialization is. Okay, so serialization is basically taking something in its use form. So what I'm saying by use form is here it's in a playground where children can use it, and it's in a space where it's being used inside of a park or something like that. And then what serialization effectively does is it takes it and it breaks it down into some way that it can either be stored or communicated, or I guess transported in the case of a playground, right? And then after it's been stored or transported, there are a set of instructions on how to deserialize. Okay, so there's serialization, but then there's also the idea of deserialization. Okay, deserialization, or some people like to call it like unserialization, or I'm sure that maybe you people in the United Kingdom call it something really funny. I'm joking. Anyway, so right, the serialization is essentially the rules by which you break down this playground, and then the deserialization is essentially doing the reverse process of breaking down the parts. Okay, the instructions on how to do that. So how does that apply to programming, or game programming for that matter? Okay, well, in programming, you have your data in its use state, right? And so when I say its use state, it's kind of in the form of data structures or objects in memory. So I don't know how like your college professors typically will do this. I guess as a college professor. All right. So we have these things, and you got like memory, locations in your RAM or whatever it might be. And you've got data allocated to these different places. So you've got bits being stored here or there. There's like ones that point to something over here. And then you have all the, fun stuff going on with memory. Okay, so that's in its use state, right? Where the program is using the data in the form of objects inside of memory. Okay, so while that's all well and good, what if you want to be able to turn off your computer, turn off the program, or something like that, right? So you would lose all that memory. So if the information in this data is useful, then you have to save it. So how do you save it? You can't just necessarily save a snapshot of the memory. Now, to some degree, but that's not what we're going to be talking about. What you do is you serialize that data. Okay, so just like the playground where you have it in your memory state, you break it down into a state that can be stored either in a hard drive, or it can be communicated such that the file, if it got put into some kind of file, it can then be put back into memory either on that computer or a different computer, and that would be the process of deserializing that information. Okay, that's really all it is. Okay, so what the serialization process does is it takes this data in its objects or its data structures in memory, and then we converted it into some kind of file, perhaps. That's what files look like on my operating system. They're pentagons. Anyways, very good. And then it can be reserialized back into, and by reserialized, I mean deserialized, not reserialized, deserialized back into memory. That's effectively what it is. Of course, it gets a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk about that. But what kind of formats are there when you serialize this data? Okay, so there are some common types. So different formats, I guess. Serialization formats, maybe. And it seems complicated. It's like, oh, a serialization format. It's really not, and you probably are familiar with many of these. So, for example, JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. Now, even though it's called JavaScript Object Notation, it's used in any number of different applications that even have nothing to do with JavaScript. It's just an object notation, and it's standardized, and it's used in a variety of different applications. And then there's XML. And so these are files that essentially can take data that was used in a program and then put it in some kind of storage state so that we can store data. And in both of those, they're kind of human readable. But then there's examples such as Pickle. And so Pickle is the proprietary Python serialization format. And the useful thing to note about Pickle is that it's a binary format. Okay, binary format. Okay, so it's not human readable just by looking at the information. I'm just trying to harken back to what we were talking about earlier about how serialization is not the opposite of binary. Okay, we don't have to know exactly what binary format means. That could potentially be another video. But the important thing is that each of these types of serialization formats can be stored in your hard drive or something like that, such that when a computer program is rebooted or something like that, it can be deserialized back into memory. Pretty neat. So how is this useful? Okay, for the purposes of game development or perhaps other types of computer programming. But this channel right now is mostly about game development, so we'll talk about it in context of game development. Okay, so how it's used. All right, so one way is for saving and loading. So when I'm talking about saving and loading, that's should be pretty obvious based on the things that we've already been mentioning. So if you're creating a game where the player wants to be able to save the current state of the game such that they can turn off the console or turn off the game and boot it back up and get back to where they were, you would want to be able to save the state of the game into some kind of file format, right? And so you would potentially be the one writing your own type of file format. So when we're talking about serialization, JSON, XML, Pickle, and this kind of stuff, there are libraries that allow you to be able to save out your data into those formats, and game engines often have that either built in or there are extensions that allow you to be able to save out those your data into JSON or load data from JSON into the game. Now you can do that, but you can also create your own proprietary format so that you're essentially saving it out to some kind of text file, and you have some kind of set of syntax basically for how your game state is being stored, and it can just be something very simple. That's essentially how configuration files work as well. Okay, so a configuration is basically just a save game, but it saves essentially the settings of a game, or perhaps the settings of an application. So for the purpose of your game, let's say your game is Playground Tycoon. Imagine that, right? Playground Tycoon, everyone's favorite game, and then you can put like actual lava on the floor. It's super fun. All right, and do that kind of thing. But let's say that the player has created their wonderful playground inside of a park, and they want to be able to come back to it. So essentially what you can do is you can save just the elements that are important for the state of their game and put it in like a JSON file or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's one use of serialization. Another use for serialization, and this is often more in kind of the actual process of developing the game, not necessarily giving some feature for a player in the game, and that's this idea of exposing properties to the property inspector, let's say inspector, or whatever the panel might be called depending on the game engine. There's this idea that you have these properties inside of the inspector, and you can modify those properties for objects that exist within some kind of scene or level. And so it's like, oh, okay, I've heard this idea before when I'm using something like Unity. You may have heard serialize field. Now, I want to break this down because that's where some of the confusion comes when people are like, what the heck is serialization? What is serialized field? And what? I'm so confused. It's really not all that confusing. Let's just first understand this in its most simple form. Okay, so when we're talking about a game engine and we have, the editor, and you have over here on the left or the right or something like that, you've got like your hierarchy of different objects, like object, 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 and then you might have a properties panel where you can modify the different settings of a object that's selected inside of the scene, right? And you've got your game where you're developing your playground simulator and little hat thing, and very cool. So the important thing to recognize is that all of your assets are essentially a serialized format. Okay, so all the junk down here in the bottom that you might have, depending on what, I feel like game engines kind of follow a similar format. I suppose like Godot might have it over here in like the bottom left by default, but Unreal, Unity, the content browser, whatever you would call it, the point is that the stuff that's saved on your hard drive is already serialized, right? So it's really not that different. The idea of a serialized field and the idea of a serialized asset, or just assets themselves, is not all that different. This is why. So if you have these scenes, right, you've got a scene here and a scene here and a scene here inside of your content browser, the scene essentially serializes these objects in some kind of default state. So all of the objects that exist inside of your hierarchy, they themselves are serialized in the form that they exist in this scene file, right? So it keeps track of what that object is, what state it's at, and what its default properties are for the scene in that particular state. Okay, so perhaps this little like hat thing, if like let's say that you have the little, this little thing here is selected, and it has properties like its XY position, it has its like rotation and that kind of stuff. All of that information has to be stored in some way, right? It exists inside of this scene file. this scene file right here. It has to know that so that when you close the editor and you reopen it, or you load one scene to another scene, or whatever you're doing, it has to remember what that rotation was, what that location was. And so all of these properties of this object that exists inside of the scene at this particular state of the scene are serialized, right? It's just serialized in some kind of format that's proprietary to that game engine, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a proprietary format. It's usually how it works out, though. Okay, and so that information is stored here in that scene file in some which way, and you don't necessarily have to worry about it because unless you're the engine developer, you don't, it just works, right? Okay, so that means that all of the properties and all the objects have to have some way of being serialized if they're going to exist in this scene. Okay, and so, what about custom fields? So, for example, let's say that your different attractions at this park are, have some kind of, what would we call it? Safety hazard rating or something like that. Hazard rating. Okay, that's hazard ratings. That's delightful. Anyway, it's like a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that. How likely a child is going to become injured on this thing. And who knows, like 1 through 10, maybe it's an integer. Okay, well, how can you modify that hazard rating from inside of the inspector? Remember, so that when you play the game, all of this information gets loaded up into memory, and coming back here into memory. And so once it's in memory, it's in its use form. So its hazard rating is something that is the object for that particular slide or attraction is storing the memory in some location allocated to the memory. Okay. But what if I want to be able to modify the hazard rating before the game even gets loaded here inside of the scene? And so we do that by exposing that property, the hazard rating of this particular attraction, this particular object inside of the game, and we expose it to the editor so that we can modify it, or the level designer can modify it. Okay? But the important thing that we have to recognize is that in order to be able to do that, we have to save it to the scene in some which way, because that's what remembers, that's where you're modifying that hazard rating. And so since you have to save it to the scene, it has to be serialized, right? So that it can be saved inside of that scene. And so in the code file, or whatever it is, this whole thing, like, so serialize field inside of Unity is just being very explicit about that's what it's doing, right? Now, some of you are like, well, sometimes public also like exposes it to the scene, when you do public access modifier. Well, all it is serialized field also, right? In fact, public, it's kind of confusing that Unity chooses to do that. This isn't a Unity specific like tutorial or something like that. The public is just also implicitly serializing the field. That's just kind of like a side effect of that access modifier inside of Unity. So it's still just doing serialized field basically. It's just also making it publicly accessible to other parts of your code base. Anyways, so the point here is that serialized field is doing exactly that. And so that would be Unity, right? And so in Godot, it might be something like export, which essentially exposes that to the editor, allows it to be saved inside of the scene in that format. So pretty cool. And it's working the same way. And then in Unreal Engine, you might see something called like uProperty, allowing you to expose a property to the scene. But the important thing to recognize about each of these little modifiers inside of your code is that in order for it to be exposed to the scene, it needs to be a data type that's serializable. Okay, so the data type must be serializable. Data type must be serializable. Okay, not all data types are magically automatically serializable. Now, of course, the primitive types like integers and floats and strings, those are usually serializable. And when I say serializable, I don't mean that the data type is just somehow natively serializable. It just means that the game engine has its way of recognizing, understanding, and writing it to the scene file. That's all that it really means, or to be able to be serialized for other reasons. And that's just something that's built into the game engine or not. All right, so you could make any data type serializable if you created that custom data type and then you wrote your own serialized type of functionality, it's totally up to you. In fact, a lot of game developers have to do that. In fact, if you want to be a strong game programmer and to, be more attractive to employers, having experience writing, custom serialization is something that can be very helpful. Okay, but depending on the game engine, some types are serializable, some types aren't. You're going to have to, check into it, see which ones are and which ones aren't, and what you can do about it. Okay, so that's effectively all that it really means when we talk about serialized field, and when we talk about, scenes. Okay, and then lastly, I suppose, and there are other things too. But the last thing that I want to talk about today is sending data over a network. Okay, and the reason why I want to talk about that is because we talked a lot about, saving things to files, and then we kind of dived a little bit deeper into like what we mean by files. But when I was mentioning kind of like the definition of serializing, I said that it not only are we unpacking this from its use form, into a way that it can be stored, but I also said so that it also can be transported, or so that it can be communicated. Okay, and so I want to talk a little bit about that too. So sending data over a network. Okay, so if your game and your, roller, did I almost say that? No, playground tycoon game, you want to be able to save your, let's start with that. You want to save the state of the game online, so that when you log into a different computer, you're able to get to the progress of your game from online. Okay, so how would you do that? Well, it's really much the same thing, right? So we created our own kind of maybe custom file type by which we're saving our files. But a lot of times when we're saving files online, we're not saving a file, we're saving data to a database. Right, and that's often the case. So, whether you've achieved an achievement or something like that, the database is what stores that information, such that your user account knows that you've accomplished that achievement. Now, that would work in any other number of different ways that are associated with your particular game, but how would you save it to a database? Well, what you do, and the process of serialization is what you're doing, is you're choosing all the most important elements that you need to keep. What are the things that you need to keep, such that when you deserialize that information, such that when you get that data, you're only getting the data that you need to be able to bring your game back into its use state. Okay, and so a database is sending the information over. You're doing the same thing. You're serializing the data from the memory, and you're only the data that's important, and you're sending it over the network, so that it gets stored in some kind of database. Okay, I love, everyone likes to draw like a database. It's like, oh, it's like a database, and then we draw like a arrow as if it all makes sense. I had to do it. So cool. No, databases are often drawn like a cylinder, aren't they? Or something like that, I guess. Anyway, we're going to do that. Database. Okay, well, what about real-time multiplayer over a network? It's the same thing, okay? So when we are talking about a game in its use state and in memory, whether we're talking about floating point numbers or strings or whatever it might be, if other players need to know that information, right, and they have their own computer with their own set of numbers and in memory, in order for them to be able to send that information over the network, there has to be some kind of serialization happening, because that information has to be in some kind of form such that it can be packaged and sent. Okay, and so I'm using the word package because that's how information is sent over a network, into these little packets of information, and only the packets that are necessary for it to, for the game, for the other players or the server to be able to do what they need to do in the game. Okay, so that information has put in these little packets of information to send over the network. That's a process of serialization. It doesn't have to turn it into actual file that's being stored on a hard drive necessarily. It can just be information that's continuously being sent back and forth in these little packets. That's a form of serialization as well. Okay, serialization kind of breaks down to things that aren't necessarily just files, saving files, loading files. It could also be potentially an undo system where you're saving little states of the game as you go along so that you can restore a particular state of the game. That's a form of serialization. But, we don't necessarily have to worry about that at this point. It's just the idea of serialization can get deeper and deeper, especially when we talk about ways of serializing information and how these serialization layers work inside of the game engine. And that's for a conversation about kind of engine development. That's not what we're talking about today. Hopefully you understood what we were talking about and essentially how it's not as complicated as a lot of, that as you might, take it to be when you first see that word. It's kind of a long word, hard to spell, especially for people overseas. I'm joking. Anyways, again, referring to the Z versus S, if you're somehow coming into the video halfway through. All right, cool. I'm going to just go ahead and stop there. Thank you for joining me, and until next, I guess first, subscribe if you haven't already, and like the video if you haven't already. And until next time, I guess, wishing you peace.